The Constitution. The Constitution is much in the news. The American people are never very far away from a constitutional debate. We are in the midst of a constitutional crisis, according to one political party, and the other political party is saying, no, nothing happened. And so the issue of impeachment has come up. Helpful to know the definition of impeachment because most of the American people don't know. According to a recent objective poll, 47% of the American people today think the president should be impeached and removed from office. Half the country thinks he should be impeached and removed from office. They apparently do not know the definition of impeachment. Because impeachment does not mean you're going to be removed from office. Bill Clinton was impeached and what? Not removed from office. A vote of impeachment simply means there's going to be a trial. And a trial could come back not guilty, Clinton, or it can come back guilty and you are going to be removed from office. But you have to have the trial first, Americans. And so to say 47% of us think he should be removed from office means they don't even care about the evidence. Every American should care about the evidence. I don't care what your party is. You should care about the evidence. Otherwise, we're headed for anarchy, chaos, and a dictator. If the truth doesn't matter anymore, that's where we're headed. And I'm not saying a dictator of the left or a dictator of the right. I don't know who would win that struggle. But I guarantee you a dictator when the truth doesn't matter anymore. Just a matter of time. The Constitution. A close study of the constitutional era reveals that good fortune, luck, or divine guidance, God, offered the American people an unusual chance at nation building, and that some honorable leaders seized that chance. That this nation was founded not only on the triumphs of the battlefield and the heroes of the war, although those were necessary, but also on the work of thinking and study, reading and experience. The idea this new nation drew upon is best referred to as republicanism. That is the word the people of this era used. They did not generally use the word democracy. They used the word republicanism. And for want of a better word, it largely means democracy, but they're not exact synonyms, okay? Republicanism, the idea that a virtuous people, key word being virtuous, may govern themselves as opposed to being governed by a king or a dictator. A virtuous people, people who still believe in truth, may govern themselves. Moreover, the founders were wise enough to create a government that allowed for change over time. Yes. The Founding Fathers didn't say, here's your government, it lasts for 1,000 years, as is. No. We have the opportunity to have constitutional amendments. You will hear Americans today talk about, well, the Founding Fathers intended this, and the Founding Fathers intended that, and if we're not doing what the Founding Fathers intended, then we're not Americans. Baloney. Due respect ought to be paid to the Founding Fathers, but we can change the Constitution if we go through the proper process, and we have. The Founding Fathers recognized that the country, guess what, folks, was not perfect. They knew it. They knew there were problems left over from the Revolution. They knew there were problems that they themselves could not solve, hence constitutional amendments. They hoped that future generations would fix some of these problems, and future generations did fix some of these problems. That is the basis of this class. Progress over time. Progress towards the ideals of liberty and equality. Historically, you can't expect any more than that. Progress over time. To judge the Founding Fathers because they were not perfect is to be simplistic, naive, silly. Do you want to be judged because you're not perfect by some future generation 200 years from now? I hope not. Because if you do that, that's what you're asking for. And so the changes made possible by constitutional amendment made it possible to overcome great evils, great inequities. The Constitution is a fulfillment of the Revolution in the sense that it derives its power from the people. The people of the Revolutionary War believed that government should derive its power from the people. The Constitution states in the very first sentence, "We the people." It is the people that have created the Constitution. But on the other hand, and this is why history is so complex, there's no unbroken line of progress from the revolutionary ideals to the fulfillment of those ideals in the Constitution. It's uneven, it's broken. Some things worked, some things didn't. For the first government of the United States, the Articles of Confederation represent a mistake. Founding Fathers said about 1786, we blew it. It ain't working, folks. We got to fix it. Did you know that you were on the second government of the United States? The Articles were the first, and they didn't work. And the Founding Fathers said, start over. This is very contrary to most politicians. I can't remember the last politician that went in front of the American people and said, we screwed up. I screwed up. I made a mistake. It's just not human nature, is it? That's what the Founding Fathers essentially did. We made a mistake. We recognize it. We have to fix it. And so they set out to do exactly that. They called the Constitutional Convention. Problems with the Articles. So what was wrong with the Articles of Convention that the Founding Fathers said needed to be addressed? We need to start over again. Because the original idea was not to start over again, it was to fix the Articles, but they pretty much realized very quickly that it's too broken. We might as well scrap the whole thing and start fresh. It's like when a car gets totaled. Can't fix it. It's too big a mess. So the Articles are totaled, right? Hard to forget that now, isn't it? I hope so. Start fresh. The founders became disenchanted with the Articles of Confederation primarily because they allowed to come to power in the state governments. Founders are worried about what's going on in the state governments. They allowed to come to power in the state governments men who lacked public virtue, or what the founders called, and this is a great word, disinterestedness. Disinterestedness, say that 3 times, is not uninterested. It is not bored. Disinterestedness means that you don't have or you don't consider your own interests in the creation of laws or government. You are disinterested. You are above your own interests. Disinterested. Crucial concept. Too many politicians today are interested in their own gain or in the gain of their party over the nation. They are not disinterested. The Founding Fathers talked and wrote about disinterestedness all the time as an essential ingredient to self-government, to republicanism. Well, the Founding Fathers were concerned that at the state government level, there were too many men who were interested. They were not disinterested. They were pursuing their own gains rather than advancing the good of the nation. James Madison, one of the most important of our Founding Fathers, wrote that men of low morals and greed have used their majorities in the various states to harm the rights of the minority and the interests of the people as a whole. What was Madison's solution? What do we do to stop these men from controlling the states for their own interests? Madison proposes now that a strong federal government be placed over a large republic, and that in doing that, it will ensure that the states are not governed in the interests of the few, or even in the interests of the many to the detriment of the few. So in other words, a more powerful central government will control the anarchy, chaos, and greed in the states. This is the primary reason for the calling of the Constitutional Convention. Because you see underneath the Articles of Confederation, that government could not do anything about the states. Too weak. Moreover, Madison argued that the federal government would naturally attract the best characters, since to gain a seat in either of the federal houses, the Senate or the Congress, one would have to appeal to a wider section of the population than if you were simply trying to get elected to a state house. So you've got to appeal to more people, and so the chances then that the greater characters, the better men would rise to the level of the federal government, Madison argued, would be the case. In short, Madison argues for a strong federal government as represented by the new Constitution because he believes that it will attract the best men, and then the new government can be used to control the state governments that are being run by lesser men, men of lesser virtue. There were other problems with the Articles of Confederation, but that is the primary one. So if I were to ask you on an exam what the primary problem with the Articles was, there it is. That too many of the states were being run by men who were interested. Not only were the Articles of Confederation too weak to control the interests of greed and party in the states, they were too weak to perform the very basics of government. Number one, there was no authority granted to the Congress underneath the Articles to tax or to print money, to coin money. So it can't tax anybody. It's completely dependent upon the states to send the federal government some tax money, if they want to. How much money do you think was coming to the Congress under the Articles? Especially not when you consider the nature of the men running the states, right? And he can't print money or coin money either. Only the states could do that. You see the power of the states versus the lack of power in the federal government. Yes?
And it was the federal government that had no authority?
That's right. That's what we're saying. So they had created this Articles of Confederation, the Congress that had guided us through the latter stages of the war and then into the 1780s and this early peace with very little power. And the reason they did that, and this is a great question, by the way, is because they were afraid of creating a too powerful government in their own midst. And what they were afraid of was Great Britain. Why would we want to create a powerful federal government or central government like Great Britain had right here at home? So they erred on the side of caution, and they made the Articles very weak, you see. And then within a few years, they realized, oops, too weak. We got to have something stronger to govern this country with. So the new Constitution is going to be a more powerful federal government. And it's going to coerce states into doing things that some of the states aren't going to want to do. So number one, no authority to tax or to coin money. Number two, no ability, obviously, to pay its bills. And you have bills that are being made by the everyday running of the government, but you also had debts left over from the Revolution. And those debts are not being paid to the foreign governments that had given us these loans, France and the Dutch and so forth. So those nations are not real happy. And this is the day when if nations didn't get paid their loans, they went to war. They invaded the countries that weren't paying their debts. So it's very serious. Number three, no authority to regulate trade between the states. No authority to regulate trade between. So some of the states are raising tariffs against other states, thus restricting trade. And the federal government can't do anything about that. Today, under the Constitution, a state cannot have a tariff against another state. Can't raise a tax against another state. Only the federal government can have tariffs. More powerful to the federal government, see? Number 4, obviously, the foreign governments do not respect us. This government is a laughingstock. It's the only democratic government in the world that matters. And here the monarchies are all laughing at us. What's the reputation of Republican government in the world at this time? Is anybody going to try this? Is this going to be a vision for the world to come, the way it is? No. In summary, because the articles were too weak to perform the basics of government, and especially because men of greed and party spirit had seized control of many of the state governments and were running them for their own benefit, the Founding Fathers believed that the ideals of the Revolution, property rights, individual freedom, and personal and public virtue, were in danger of destruction at the hands of these greedy men at the state level. Were they right? States in disarray. I'll give you a couple examples. The states were indeed in political and economic chaos. Massachusetts was governed by men who would not listen to the pleas of farmers. And the majority of people in Massachusetts at this time are farmers, the vast majority. And the farmers are having a very difficult time, many of them facing bankruptcy. But those who ran the state would not extend credit, would not lower interest rates, not help these farmers at all. Turned a deaf ear. In response, Daniel Shay's Rebellion. Daniel Shay is a Revolutionary War captain. Led a rebellion that the authorities only barely succeeded in putting down in Massachusetts. The farmers rose in rebellion. There is violence in Massachusetts against this tyranny. And Shay's rebellion then catches the attention of the Founding Fathers and Americans all over the country, and it leads to the calling of what? The Constitutional Convention. I don't know if the Founding Fathers would have called the convention had it not been for Shay's. Problems were clear, but Shay's rebellion seems to be the straw that broke the camel's back. So hugely important, Shay's rebellion. It's not successful in terms of its goal in Massachusetts, but it does lead to the calling of the Constitutional Convention. Rhode Island is in the opposite situation. In Rhode Island, the common people actually seized control of the government. That was unsuccessful in Massachusetts. But in Rhode Island, it was. And they started to print money. Just get those printing presses out and start to roll off the bills, right? What does that lead to? Yeah, economic chaos, rampant inflation. The money that had existed was worthless. The debts and such were now being paid back by worthless money. If you had loaned money out before this, then you were stuck because these people are paying you off now with paper money that doesn't have any value. Ruin. So you see on either side of the coin here, to use a pun, you have disaster. You have interested men. The convention. If you had asked the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, good day to know. As I like to say, the doggone date is so important it should not be on a test. And it isn't. But we all, as Americans, do you think we ought to know when the convention was called and met and decided these great things? 1787. If you had asked them what they hoped to do to create, they would have told you a stronger federal republic, a government, a stronger federal government. It's proper to ask then, what is a republic? What's the definition? James Madison again wrote, "A republic was nothing more and nothing less than a government which derives all its powers directly or indirectly from who? The people." Again, we the people, first sentence of the Constitution. And it is administered by persons holding their offices for a limited period. And then what do they have to do? Give up the office and stand for election or re-election, right? For a limited period. This republic, according to the Founding Fathers, also presumes that the people are virtuous, there's that word again, moral, and responsible. In fact, John Adams, one of our great Founding Fathers, is a quote I love. He said, "This republic will last only as long as the people are virtuous." Because everything depends on the people in this kind of government, folks. Everything does. Are they fair-minded? Are they honest? Are they truthful? If not, we are only fit for the yoke of a dictator. The great problem the delegates faced was how representation was to be accomplished. The great problem, thus the great compromise, right? How do we represent ourselves in this new federal government? The small states wanted their interests protected, and they feared a Congress based solely on population. Small states, generally in terms of size of the land mass, but because that means, generally speaking, a few in population, right? Delaware, Rhode Island. Big state, Pennsylvania, New York, big population, Virginia. The small states were terrified that if they were to join in a more powerful federal government, the large states would lord it over them because they have so much population. And the large states did not want to give up their advantage in population to mollify or to appease the small states. So you've got almost an impasse. It almost broke the Constitutional Convention on this issue. Finally, after weeks of arguing, a compromise was struck. A compromise is not a four-letter word. Today, we think compromise, the Republicans, compromise with the Democrats. The Democrats compromise with Republicans, vote them out of office. No compromise. Ladies and gentlemen, no compromise back here. You got no government. You got no country. Our whole system of government is based on compromise. I give up a little bit, you give up a little bit, we meet in the middle, compromise. Nobody's perfectly happy, but nobody is totally lost either. We've lost that in the last 20 years. We've lost it. And because we've lost it, we're as divided as we've ever been. And the future is not bright unless we get it back. So what was the great compromise? The little states are represented equally with the big states in which house? The Senate. Doesn't matter if you're from a little state or big state, you only get how many senators? 2. So today, Montana has 2 senators. And Texas has 2 senators, and California has 2 senators. New York has 2 senators. These are huge states. Montana, population-wise, one of the smallest states in the Union. See? So the Senate represents the people or the states? The states. The Senate represents the states. This is not democratic, ladies and gentlemen. Montana barely has 1 million people in it. They get the same representation as California that's got 50 million people in it. That's not democracy. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Okay? But let's understand democracy. 1 man, 1 vote. 1 woman, 1 vote. In the Senate, Montana has got 50 times the votes of California. See? In the Senate. Do we all understand this? Okay. Which is why oftentimes people will say we need to elect senators based on population and do away essentially with the states. Okay? It's one of those ideas that's out there. So, the House of Representatives is based on population. Yeah. Montana, last time I looked, has 1 congressman. Just 1. They actually have more senators. California, I don't know how many they've got. I've lost count. 50, 60, something like that. You see the difference. Which is more democratic? I'm not asking you which is more correct, right, truthful, whatever. Democratic means 1 person, 1 vote. Well, clearly the House is more democratic. Okay? Well, Madison argued, you guys are arguing over the wrong thing. Big states, little states. Doesn't matter. The fear was that the big states would align themselves against the small states would be at the mercy of the big states. But Madison said that's not the way the states are going to align, big versus small. They're going to align based on the issue, based on geography, north-south, based on culture, north-south, based on economic interests. You're worried about the wrong thing, Madison said. As it turned out, of course, Madison was right. The real issue was not big versus small. It was a difference of culture and economics and so forth that would force these various alignments. Nowhere was Madison's analysis of how the nation might split more accurate than in the discussion over slavery. Yes, the representatives in the Constitutional Convention argued over slavery. It was there. Southern slave owners wanted their slaves counted as citizens. Now, this gets confusing, folks. So bear with me here. But once you get it, you'll have it. You won't need to write it down. You're a Southern slaveholder, and the representation in the House of Representatives is going to be based on the number of people who live in your state. The more people in your state, the more representatives you get. And so the Southerners said, count our slaves as people. Now, if you think that's great for the slaves, you don't get it yet. Okay? Because the Northerners who were opposed to slavery are going to say, no, no, no! We're not going to count them as people. Bunch of racists, right? No. No, the Northerners wanted to end slavery. The Southerners want to keep it. The Southerners want their slaves counted as people, so the Southerners will have more representatives in the House so that they can vote to keep slavery. How hypocritical can you get? That's about armpit level, right? In terms of hypocrisy. Yeah. Count our slaves so that we can be sure they stay slaves. Okay. This issue, again, is going to divide the Constitutional Convention, and unless there's a, compromise, you're not going to have a government, folks. It's not going to help the slaves any, because they're going to have their own country. And there won't be anything you can do as a Northerner about that. The only hope of ending slavery is that we're all one country, you see. So you got to compromise. And so the Northerners said, okay, fine. You can count 3/5 of your slaves. So you can get a few more representatives from the southern states. but not if you counted all the slaves, not as many as if you'd done that. And so we compromised on that. But the Northerners said, we are not going to have the word slave or slavery in the Constitution. Okay? Not going to have those words in there, because some future lawyer will say, well, the Constitution supports slavery. Look at the word. There's the word slave right there, and there's the word slavery right there in the Constitution. And the Northerners, they have their share of good lawyers. We're not going to put those words in there. See? Well, it's a modest victory. So you have what's called the 3/5 clause. Southerners get to count 3/5 of their slaves for purposes of representation. The powers of the executive. What kind of chief executive are we going to have? What are we going to call this person? The fear is they don't want to recreate what in America? They're afraid of what? Thank you. Somebody said monarchy. Absolutely. What if we recreate a powerful central government and we accidentally create a monarchy here? We got to be careful. We don't want George Washington to become King George I, right? We've already had our fill of the King Georges in Great Britain. So, how much power are we going to give this person? Passions ran high. On the other hand, there had to be someone responsible for the government on a day-to-day basis. Congress was only going to meet every other year. Yeah, can you imagine that? Every other year. You leave your district and you go to the national capital for a few months, and that's it. So somebody's got to run the show every day. The president. Has to be there for emergencies. You have to have somebody, according to Montesquieu, to check the power of Congress, right? Checks and balances? Sure. But history provided no example. Oh yeah, there's the president of France. No. There's the president of Russia. No. There is no such democracy. We're it. One of our fine constitutional historians, William Lee Miller, has written, the only model was sitting there in front of them. Dignified, quiet, universally admired, respected. He was above the battles of factions of parties. Impartial. He was honored for his selfless devotion to the common good, not intervening, but presiding over the councils of this constitutional convention, a presider, president. Yes, the executive was to be George Washington. And so the office of president was constructed in the belief that a noble character would inhabit that office. A noble character. A man of virtue, of morality, of disinterestedness, of courage, wisdom, common sense. That fact, combined with the reality that no one was really very certain about how this government was going to work, and that the office of president would largely be defined by its first occupant. What he did would become precedent, standard, the model. Americans have forgotten this, taken it for granted. Ratification. Well, you got to get this constitutional document approved, right? In order to become law. And the Constitution itself provided that 9 of the 13 states, must ratify or approve the Constitution for it to go into effect for those 9 states. You got to get 9. And the Constitution was to be approved by special state conventions. It doesn't go to the state legislature and the state legislatures then vote up or down. No, 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 no. The states are not going to give the people their government because the Constitution says we the people, right? Not we the states. And so the Constitution set out that each state has to call a constitutional convention, special delegates elected of the people to go to the state constitutional convention to vote up or down on the Constitution. Not the state legislatures. We the people. As it turned out, and this is a fascinating then debate in these various states, but New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify. But before we get there, we have the debates that went on for months. Because there were many Americans who were defiantly opposed to the new Constitution because it was so powerful. They were afraid that it would coerce them in their states in a way that the Articles of Confederation never did do. They were right about that. This is a much more powerful government, and it could reach down into the states and coerce individuals. It could do that. And they were afraid. Take away our rights, our liberties. And so the Federalists, those are the men who were arguing for the Constitution, for the new, more powerful federal Constitution, the Federalists. And their essays that were printed in newspapers across the country explained why we should approve, the American people should approve the Constitution. And those papers then were later collected into a book, and they're called the Federalist Papers. They are arguments for the Constitution, a more powerful government. But the anti-Federalists, those who were opposed, it's real easy now with these labels, right? They wrote articles and essays as well saying, no, 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 don't do this. It'll take away our freedoms, our liberties. We won't be able to stop these people. Patrick Henry of Virginia, the old rabble-rouser that was for the revolution. Remember, give me liberty or give me death? Anti-Federalist. He's afraid of this new, more powerful federal government should the Constitution be approved. It's close. But the Federalists win the day. Now, New Hampshire is not on the test, folks. That's a trivial pursuit question, isn't it? Doesn't really matter New Hampshire or whether it was Virginia or whether it was New York or whatever. No. So, don't waste your time. Oh gosh, I got to remember New Hampshire. No, you don't. You got to remember the arguments, the ideas that are at stake, you see. The whys. Yes?
How was the government power restored in Rhode Island?
I'm sorry?
How was the government power restored in Rhode Island?
Oh, that's a great question. So what happens in Rhode Island to bring the government back into control? Well, now with the passing of the Constitution eventually, then the federal government is going to be able to act in Rhode Island. Of course, the people of Rhode Island are going to see the handwriting on the wall, you see. All right, so they know that they're not going to be able to continue to do what they had been doing. Okay. So the whole idea that this federal Constitution could bring order to the states is what's going on here. Okay. So the Constitution is proved. And then gradually those states that had been slow to approve of it, they came into the Union. So all the original colony states eventually joined. So the Founding Fathers had set out to build a Novus Ordo Seclorum, new order for the ages. But if you were to try to build the world anew, the first thing you must understand is that you cannot really do it. Not all in one step. The world will not be as new as you thought it would be if you try to do it all in one step. And if you know this, you may make it somewhat newer and somewhat better. I'm not saying you can't make it better. I'm saying that if you try to do too much, that engenders a backlash, and you end up with nothing. Look at France in the French Revolution. Look at the Soviet Union in the Russian Revolution, although that took longer, you see. But history teaches very severe lessons for those who try to do too much. If you know this, you may make it somewhat new or somewhat better, and if you do not know this, you will fail altogether. The Americans did know this. And Madison, again, expressed it in this way. He wrote, "There is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust. So there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence." Madison is saying mankind is sinful, mankind is greedy. We should distrust men because of these things. But he also said that mankind has certain things that are positive and moral and so forth, and we have to build on those. Madison believes that men can govern themselves if you take into account the evil and so forth. You see, Christianity puts it this way. All men are sinful, according to the Bible, right? We are all sinful. Greedy, hateful, lustful, dishonest, immoral, etc., etc. We all know the category of sins. But what else does the Bible tell us about mankind? That God loves us. He sees something in us that is powerful and positive, and He wants to redeem us and build on that. That's Madison. That's Christianity. Now, the Enlightenment simply posits that mankind is good. Period. It is institutions that are evil. So if you get rid of the institutions, then mankind will create good and powerful and positive relationships, okay? The whole question then is Madison right? Is Christianity right? That mankind is a mixed bag? Or are the Enlightenment philosophers right that mankind is essentially good, and if you get rid of monarchy, everything's fine? Later on, after monarchies were pretty much done away with, the Enlightenment philosophers said, get rid of capitalism and everything will be fine. That's communism, okay? Yeah. So there you go, because mankind is good. Now, if you read about history and you watch your local news or your national news, just keep asking yourself, is mankind good? I mean, absolutely good. So that if you got rid of religion, if you got rid of monarchy, if you got rid of capitalism, then everything would be great. Is that what we see? If that's not what you see, then you've got a problem with Enlightenment philosophy, don't you? And what they build on that philosophy will not work. That's what the Founding Fathers are saying. Well, all of this wisdom, study, and care of the Founding Fathers may have been wasted had it not been for George Washington. Founding Fathers did almost everything right, and it still might have gone in the garbage can, and probably would have, because of the nature of man. Except, as Miller says, for George Washington. Washington had planted in him so deeply a sense of honor that he already, by 1787, in the midst of the Constitutional Convention, had rejected any Napoleonic dictatorial role for himself, either then or in the future. He declined to be Caesar. He declined to be king. And he not only declined to be the leader of a military intervention in government, but in a moving moment in Newburgh, New York in 1783 at the close of the Revolution, when the Revolutionary Army officers were angry, they had not been paid, they had been ignored, their plight had been shoved aside by Congress, and they wanted to march on Philadelphia and take the government in their own hands. A military coup. Displacing Congress. And they wanted Washington to lead them. And ladies and gentlemen, there's no doubt they would have been successful had Washington led them. But he said no. And he cleverly shamed them and turned away their anger and reunited them in a matter of a few words. The loyalty to the government that they had fought to create. Thomas Jefferson later wrote of this episode at Newburgh, the moderation and virtue of a single character probably prevented this revolution from being closed, as most others have been, by a subversion of that liberty it was intended to establish. He's talking about George Washington at Newburgh. In spite of everything I've said, it may be true that Otto von Bismarck, the great chancellor of Germany in the late 19th century, was correct when he said, "A special providence takes care of fools, drunks, and the United States of America." Surely most of the founders agreed with that last statement, that a special providence takes care of the United States of America. Questions? Any questions? Yes. So the Federalist Papers are the collection of important essays, many of them written by James Madison, others written by Alexander Hamilton, others by John Jay, that argued why to the American people they should approve of the Constitution as created in the Constitutional Convention. It is for the creation of a more powerful federal government. That's why they're called Federalists. And it's the anti-Federalists who are on the other side of the issue. And there are anti-Federalist papers. They're not as famous as the Federalist Papers. Okay? Anybody else? Any other questions? All right, there's a lot. Yes, question? Okay, there's a lot in this lecture that might be on a test. So give me some of the more important points here. Yes?
Causes and effects of the Great Compromise.
Yeah, so why did the Founding Fathers at the Constitutional Convention compromise? What was the Great Compromise? Excellent. Yeah, what's the significance of Shay's Rebellion, right? Why do we remember it 200 and some odd years later? Okay, yes? Why did the Articles of Confederation not work? Here are lessons in government. If you're creating a new government in some place in the world, and you're wondering how much power and what to do, and you should be looking at the Articles of Confederation and at our Constitution, and you should be saying, well, what are the lessons we can learn here? That is exactly what James Madison did with previous governments at his time. As he read in the history in the past. What works, what doesn't. Okay? What else? According to William Lee Miller, who saved the Constitution? Who saved the country? Now, who was the indispensable man? I use that word. I used that word before I adopted the text that you guys are reading. And of course, that word is in the text, right? The indispensable man. Good. And this is the opinion now of most modern scholars. There was a time when Washington, because he's not a great philosopher or writer or something like that, was not thought so highly of. It was Thomas Jefferson. It was Alexander Hamilton, the great thinkers, John Adams, see. But now we've come back to the practical Washington and his accomplishments, and we place him at the forefront of the Founding Fathers. I think it's a good correction. Anybody else? Any other comments? Okay, God bless you all.